I am your host, Gwen Caldwell. My esteemed guest today is Dr. Peter McCue, and he's calling in. I'm in contact with him over in Bear's Den, north of Glasgow, Scotland. So welcome, Peter. Thank you for joining the show today.
Well, thank you for inviting me on.
So, Peter, I wonder if you could give our listening audience a little bit of your background. You are the author of a book about the paranormal and the UFO hotspots, and maybe you could talk a little bit about what is in the book, and then we'll go from there.
Right. Well, the book is called Zones of Strangeness and subtitled An Examination of Paranormal and UFO Hotspots. And it looks at the connection between reported paranormal and UFO phenomena and places. It starts with some introductory chapters which give background information about paranormal phenomena, the UFO phenomena, Bigfoot, and so on. And then it talks about various locations in Great Britain which are allegedly or have been allegedly hotspots for such phenomena. And then it considers places elsewhere. For instance, I consider several places in the United States. And I also talk about Puerto Rico and the Malabar Plain in Australia and a forest or wood in Romania. And then there's a concluding sort of summing up chapter.
Okay, and how is it that you got interested in this phenomena?
Well, I've had an interest in the subject on and off since I was a child, I would say. And I used to work as a psychologist, a clinical psychologist, and after I retired, I was able to sort of devote more time to this interest. And this fascination or interest in the connection or the idea of so-called paranormal hotspots had been interest to me sometimes. So eventually I thought, well, I've done quite a lot of reading and research and some investigation related to this, and so it would be worth writing a book on it. It actually turned out to be quite an arduous task. The book's quite a long book, lots of references, and I was finding that as I was preparing the book, that another book would come out which would bear on the subject I was writing about, so I'd have to buy another book and read more material, and so it seemed a sort of almost endless task. I think if I wrote another book, I'd make sure it was on a narrower subject so that it was easier to do.
Okay, I have some questions that were submitted, and I want to just start with what is different about the hot spots, and what creates that phenomena?
One of the problems about this whole area is that it's very difficult to know for sure whether places really are hotspots. Perhaps the main problem is the lack of background information about other places, comparative data. For example, if an area of, say, North Carolina acquired a reputation for being a hotspot for UFOs or for Bigfoot or for other sorts of strange phenomena, without having comparative data from elsewhere, it would be hard to say for sure that that particular location really was a hotspot. It could, for instance, be that once an area gets some publicity and people start writing about it or talking about it on a radio, other witnesses from the area will come forward and report their own experiences. But if you were to put the microscope on another area, say at random, and make detailed, it could be that that area, which hadn't received so much publicity, would also turn out to be just as active. So it can actually be hard to know whether places are hotspots. But so what I've had to do really in my own writing about this is to sort of weigh up the evidence and give an impressionistic guess whether I think the place might be a hotspot or not. I think in some cases the evidence is stronger than others. An interesting thing something that fascinates me is this question of overlap. I think there's a tendency for people interested in certain aspects of the paranormal or UFOs to focus purely on their particular interest area and not take an interest in other areas. For example, I believe that there are people in the UFO field who don't really have much interest or indeed knowledge of the paranormal more generally. And equally, there are people on that side of the fence who are interested in things such as ghosts, who don't know much about UFOs and perhaps steer away from that subject, thinking that there's no connection or that that subject's a different thing altogether. My impression is that there's a considerable overlap, and I'm particularly fascinated actually by what I call overlap cases, where there are cases which include a mixture of phenomena from these different areas. And this has actually led me to hypothesize, it's my best guess about what's really going on, is that all these different phenomena are connected, and that they actually may be manifestations of a higher intelligence, which is capable of playing tricks with us and presenting phenomena in multifaceted ways. But the origin of the phenomena may be the same, whether it appears in the form of Bigfoot or UFO sightings or strange poltergeist phenomena. It could be that there's a sort of a tricksterish intelligence behind the scene pulling the strings. And I don't mean necessarily something from outer space or extraterrestrial. I think this intelligence may have been here forever, as long as we've been here. And that it's capable of producing a multifaceted array of phenomena.
Do you think that ancient civilizations, that there's a connection with hotspot areas, perhaps rituals that they did that created the hotspots, or vice versa?
I obviously don't know. I'm speculating. There has been a suggestion, for instance, in the United States, of an association between hotspot areas and Native American sites. And that could be the case. However, another possibility I think that's worth considering is that if there is a tricksterish intelligence at work, it may actually deliberately throw in red herrings, as it were. In other words, if you find an area that has a lot of UFO activity and you also find that it's a native Indian reservation, people might be tempted to think there's a connection and the phenomena are related to native Indians in some way or their past, which may be the case. On the other hand, it could be, as I say, that if this intelligence, if there is such a thing, is wanting to mislead us and play tricks with us, it could produce phenomena in certain areas to give that impression that it may not actually be true.
Are there any hot spots that show no evidence of people ever occupying those areas?
I'm not aware of any. I'm certainly aware of areas that are essentially rural, which reportedly have a lot of activity of one sort or another, although there are population centers in them. One of them is the San Luis Valley, which runs from Colorado down into northern New Mexico. Now, reportedly, over the years, that's been the setting for UFO sightings, cattle mutilations, and other phenomena. Whether they truly cluster there more than elsewhere, I can't say for sure. But I haven't visited that valley myself, but I gather that it's a high valley. The floor of the valley is quite high. The mountains on either side rise up to something like 14,000 feet, and that it's predominantly a rural area, but it's certainly not free of population altogether, of course. Another area which I know you're aware of from a previous interview you did, which has a reputation for UFO sightings and strangeness, is northeast Utah. Again, there are population centers there, although it's largely a rural area. Although that particular case, though, I'm thinking of what's known as the Skinwalker Ranch, that particular case is a bit confusing because there have been some contradictory assertions made about what's gone on there.
I would like to get into the Skinwalker Ranch issue when we come back from break so that we're not interrupted by the break in covering that.
Yeah.
But so is there a different type of magnetic energy or is there some energy difference in those hot spots than in other areas that you're aware of?
Certainly some theorists have said exactly that. A well-known one is the American neuropsychologist Michael Persinger. He's from the States originally, but he's based in Canada. Now, he and other researchers have suggested
Peter, hold that thought. Welcome back to the show, Peter. When we went to break, we were talking about a doctor from Canada that was examining the magnetic issue related.
Yes.
Could you continue with that thought?
Yes, certainly. The person I was mentioning was Michael Persinger, a neuropsychologist who's he's from the United States but based in Canada now. And he's written lots of articles and has argued for some time that there's an association between ghostly phenomena, hauntings, and UFOs and geomagnetic factors. If you have houses or places based in seismically active areas, you can have energy effects coming from the ground, which can physically produce strange phenomena, light balls, for example, which might be taken to be UFOs, and that these energy effects can also directly affect the brain, producing unusual sensory impressions and hallucinations. And he and his colleagues have presented some interesting reports of where haunted locations or supposedly haunted locations have been examined and unusual magnetic fields have been found. They've also done research where they've taken subjects and subjected them to pulsating sort of magnetic fields through a sort of headset, a helmet, and they've been able to produce in subjects feelings that have some similarity or resemble those that people have reported in haunted locations. So therefore, there is this argument that maybe where you've got hot spots, there are unusual magnetic fields that can affect equipment and affect the nervous system. A problem, although I don't reject that assertion, a problem with it, in my view, is that there are many cases where people have had strange experiences collectively, and those strange experiences have begun and seemingly ended at the same time. Now, you wouldn't expect that if the experience were due to some sort of magnetic field affecting the brain. By the same token, if you and I sat down and at, say, 12 a.m., we both took LSD, you wouldn't expect us both to start having a drug experience at precisely the same time and for the content of the experience to be exactly the same and for the experience to finish at the same time. So my suggestion is that although magnetic fields may, in some cases, have an influence on people's experiences, maybe they can facilitate them. In some of these more high strangeness cases, or the high strangeness type of cases that I'm interested in, I think there's probably some sort of external orchestration, some sort of intelligence directing them, and it's not just due to impersonal geomagnetic factors.
Do you find that there are certain times of the year when the UFO sightings increase, or certain hot spots that are more active during certain times of the year, or does that seem to make a difference?
I'm not sure generally whether there's any definite connection with the time of the year. The trouble with hotspots, with UFO hotspots, and indeed with ghostly phenomena, is that they often wax and wane anyway, and that the phenomena may build up, run for a while, and then sort of die away. In fact, I'm not aware of any very extremely long-term hotspots. Places tend to be hotspots for some, maybe for months or years, and then they die down. It's a bit like volcanoes becoming dormant or even extinct. So as for whether there's a definite relation between the month of the year and the greater likelihood, I'm not sure.
So let's talk about Skinwalker Ranch. What do you know about Skinwalker Ranch?
Well, I must be honest and say for the start that I haven't been there. But I don't think that probably makes a great deal of difference because, as you're aware, I think yourself, the owners of the ranch don't let people on it. What I do know is this, that the case of the Skinwalker Ranch was publicized in a very readable book, published, I think, in 2005 by Colm Kelleher, who's, I think, a biochemist by background, and George Knapp, who has a media journalism background. And they described an extraordinary series of events going back years, but I can give a very brief outline. If would you like me to do that just for a minute or so, just
sure.
for readers, for listeners who may not be familiar with the case?
Sure.
According to Kelleher and Knapp, the property was owned by a family who sold it to a family that they refer to pseudonymously as the Gormans. And the Gormans bought the ranch in 1994. And very soon they started experiencing strange phenomena. They encountered, for instance, a very large wolf-like creature which attacked one of their calves. Now, they shot the creature several times and it trotted away. Gorman and his son followed it, and then it seemed to vanish into thin air. There were UFO sightings, reportedly. Orbs were seen. Cattle were mutilated. Animals disappeared. An unworldly, strange structure was seen at times in the sky. In 1996, the ranch was bought by an organization known as the National Institute for Discovery Science. This organization was funded by the American billionaire Robert Bigelow, and scientific personnel were available to monitor the site. Tom Gorman, the man who'd previously owned the ranch, he was hired as a sort of ranch manager, kept an eye on things when the NIDS people weren't there. Initially, during NIDS ownership, not much happened, but things started picking up, and phenomena occurred almost every time, or every time people were there, and then they fizzled out. Then, allegedly, according to the book, the Kelleher left NIDS. That's Colm Kelleher, one of the co-authors. Now, a book came out in 2010 by a Utah man called Dr. Frank Salisbury. And this was the second edition of a book called the Utah UFO Display. And Frank took an interest in the Skinwalker Ranch case and made some inquiries. And his discoveries, in many respects, didn't accord with what was recorded in Hunt for the Skinwalker. For example, the information about the history of the ranch given in Hunt for the Skinwalker seems to be wrong. I shan't go into too many details in case I bore people, but just to give one example, according to Hunt for the Skinwalker, the previous owners, who were known by the name as Myers, acquired the property in the 1950s, but that apparently wasn't the case. They'd acquired the ranch in 1933, and there were various factual differences between what was in Hunt for the Skinwalker and the information that Frank Salisbury had unearthed. However, on the basis of his inquiries and one of his contacts, Frank is of the opinion that although Hunt for the Skinwalker gets some of the details wrong, that the ranch has indeed been the setting for some strange phenomena. Now, the problem is that the ranch now is off limits to other people. It seems as if the Bigelow organization is still in control of it, and it also seems, or at least it was until a year or two ago, and may still be the case, that Colm Kelleher is still involved in some way. So quite what's going on there, if anything, I don't know. It could be that the Bigelow organization are retaining ownership of the property to monitor what may be happening there. But in the light of the uncertainty, it is difficult to know precisely, as I say, what's happening there now.
Okay, hold that thought. We'll be right back.
Free speech guaranteed. You're listening to the Orion Talk Radio Network.
Since 9/11, the people of the United States have sadly witnessed the largest transformation in our nation's history. And since then, we've collectively been terrorized over and over again. by flag-waving politicians and the corporate news media. We've been sold a nebulous, never-ending war on terror. We've been psychologically conditioned with fear through repeated, endless warnings. A Patriot Act that threatens our democracy. A Military Commissions Act that disregards our Bill of Rights. A Homegrown Terrorism Act that makes us all a threat. And an oppressive fascist state before you know it. Have you ever asked yourself, of all the government failures on 9/11, how is it that our politicians made us pay the price? Don't buy the lie. We're Americans, and we don't give up our Constitution to anyone, terrorists or politicians. We fought wars just to have these rights, and at Orion Talk Radio, we're damn well going to fight to keep them.
Welcome back, Peter. I'm wondering about the... is there more UFO paranormal activity on certain continents or certain areas of the world than others, or is it pretty evenly spread out?
My guess is that it's pretty evenly spread out. I don't know. I think the problem is that communication and language barriers. For instance, we know that there are quite a few places in the United States that have still or have at times been supposed to have been hotspots, but in places such as maybe Afghanistan or the former Soviet Union, Russia, and so on, where from the perspective of English speakers, the information may not be as freely available. It's perhaps hard to know. And I suppose if countries are war-torn or afflicted with famine and so on, the reporting of paranormal events might come low down on the schedule. So it may be difficult to tell. But my guess is that these things happen. They seem to pop up all over the place.
Do you believe the phenomena are categories between interdimensional, extraterrestrial, and spiritual entities? What is the nature of what we're witnessing?
Well, as I say, my guess, and it's a hypothesis, I can't prove it. In fact, it's probably unprovable. But my guess is, looking at this overall field, is that there's probably a higher intelligence orchestrating these phenomena. In other words, I don't think these phenomena can be explained in terms of separate theories. I think if you advance, if there are separate theories, but there are separate theories, for instance, that try to explain ghosts. There are theories that try to explain UFO phenomena, ranging from the very skeptical view that it's all misperception, right through to the idea it's extraterrestrials. But my guess is that what's behind a lot of this high strangeness material is an orchestrating, is an intelligence that's actually that's manifesting itself. From this perspective, I'd say that when people see UFOs, the UFOs may only have a temporary existence. They may be essentially stage props for a drama. In other words, if the intelligence, whatever its nature, wants to create some sort of UFO phenomenon, the UFOs that are seen at that point, they don't exist after the experience is over. They don't go anywhere. They just sort of cease to exist because their function has been served. Similarly, if someone's driving down the road and they see an apparitional car, a car that's sort of coming towards them, then it just disappears, or they see a phantom figure that vanishes. By the same token, I'd suggest that perhaps this entity doesn't exist in another dimension, hasn't disappeared to another world. It simply ceased to exist because it was a temporary stage prop orchestrated deliberately for effect. I think an advantage of looking at these phenomena that way, it gets around a lot of the problems that obtain if you do assume that these entities come from some other place or other dimension. For example, UFOs seem to appear in a bewildering array of shapes and sizes and colors. And sometimes they morph into different shapes while people are looking at them, or they split into different objects, or maybe different UFOs combine into one object. Now, if we assume that these things are essentially creations of the moment, that I think is easier to understand than if we assume that they're actual physical entities coming from another place or another dimension.
Do you believe that some people are more capable of witnessing these, or by virtue of how we're programmed to see what we see? I know I've been to many places where there are petroglyphs, and almost all of those places have petroglyphs that would indicate off-planet contact with the Aboriginals or the original peoples of that area. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's quite possible that those people centuries ago did have paranormal experiences. Whether the entities or the experiences they had related to anything extraterrestrial, I don't know. But I would suggest they could have been contacts with this intelligence, which can manifest itself in any way it wishes. There has been a tendency for UFO sightings over the years to sort of match science fiction to some extent. The type of, for instance, at the turn of the century, around the turn of the 20th century, that is, there were sightings of mysterious airships. And then later in the 20th century, I think in the 1930s, rocket-shaped craft was seen, and then we have the saucer-type shapes. Now, some skeptics have suggested that these are all sort of illusions and delusions and imaginings based on science fiction. But another way of thinking about it is that if these phenomena are orchestrations of some sort of intelligence, it may be that this intelligence takes cognizance of current preoccupations and science fiction, and it shapes the phenomenon accordingly. But just to go back to something you said a few moments ago, yes, I agree with you. I think that there are certain people who seem to be much more prone to experiencing these sorts of phenomena, and indeed some of them actually be catalysts for them. There was a man, for instance, when I was working as a psychologist, a patient, who came my way, and I've referred to him pseudonymously as James, and he suffered from anxiety, which was related, at least in part, to his poor physical health. And to be honest, I wasn't able to do much for him from a clinical point of view. But he told me of a whole welter of strange experiences he'd had going back years, and that they crossed the boundaries. He'd experienced ghostly phenomena in a flat. He moved flats and continued to experience sort of minor poltergeist-type events of one sort or another. At one point he was with a friend and they had a UFO experience with missing time. Another occasion he saw what may have been an apparition on a railway station. And at times he felt that he had sort of extrasensory ESP sort of information about other people. He knew things about them that you wouldn't have expected him to know. So, yes, I think he was probably an example, or is, perhaps still is, an example of someone who is unusually psychic.
Now, do you think any of these modern-day sightings that we're seeing are actually technology that our militaries are in possession of, that they have created, that we're witnessing?
Yeah. I think that's probably the case in some instances, and it's a big problem. In the Dulce area of New Mexico, that area has a history of strange phenomena going back years, UFO sightings, strange animals, and so on. But there have been suggestions that some of these manifestations, or at least may have been orchestrated deliberately by covert operations by the military or intelligence services. Yes, I do think that that's a possibility. It has been claimed, for instance, that during the time that the U-2 spy plane came into operation, that the CIA was quite happy for people to think of it as a UFO or something exotic, because that would then distract people from realizing what it really was. And it's also been suggested that when stealth aircraft were being flown in Nevada, tested in Nevada, that the intelligence agencies were happy to draw people's attention.
Welcome back to the show, Peter. I just wonder if you could give out information about where people might find your book, if you have a website, or where the book is available and how they can get more information about that.
Yes, the book is available on from various outlets. In fact, it's available. The easiest way is probably to go to Amazon. That's the one that most people know about, Amazon.com, if you're in the States. There was actually, until recently became available, a Kindle version, but unfortunately I discovered not long after it had appeared that there were formatting problems. I think in converting files there'd been some formatting problems, so I've been in touch with the publishers, and I've sent corrections, and they're trying to get that sorted out. The errors weren't of my making, I must say. It was a formatting problem. That flawed version with the formatting errors is also currently available in Google Books, so I'd advise someone not to buy the Google Book version of my book just yet, because I'm hoping that once these errors are corrected, the Google Book file will be changed and the formatting problems will be resolved. So the printed book is available, as I say, and the corrected Kindle version should be available within a couple of months, I would have thought, and similarly with the Google Books version. It's also available as a PDF version, which can be downloaded from the publishers, who are Author House of Indiana. But if you type into the search engine just Zones of Strangeness, information about the book will come up.
Okay. All right, great. And so can you tell the audience a little bit about your book and what the contents are and that kind of a thing? And what is the price of your book?
I'm not sure of the American price. I think it's something like $22 or something like that. I'd have to check on Amazon.com. It's about, in British terms, it's about £16, 29 or something like that. The Kindle version, of course, will be much cheaper. But as I say, if anyone's interested in buying that, I'd suggest they wait 2 or 3 months to make sure they don't get the version. Well, I think the flawed version with the formatting problems has been withdrawn, but the corrected version should be out, I would have thought, within a couple of months or so.
Okay.
Now, the contents of the book, there are 5 foundation chapters. I talk there about an outline of the paranormal. I talk about hauntings and poltergeist phenomena and theories relating to them. Talk about Bigfoot phenomena and the UFO phenomenon. Then there are several chapters there are quite a few chapters on British sites, which have over the years allegedly been the setting for UFO manifestations or hauntings or ghostly phenomena, or a mix of them, strange phenomena generally. And then there's a fairly long chapter on American locations, such as the Yakima Indian Reservation in Washington State, northeast Utah, where the Skinwalker Ranch is based, Colorado, the Bridgewater Triangle in Massachusetts, the Hudson Valley, and so on. And then there's a chapter on Puerto Rico and the Bermuda Triangle. And then there's one on Australia and a location in Romania. And then there's a concluding chapter. So I think if readers look at it, they'll find the book is well referenced, and it contains 14 outline maps, and the book also has an index, which unfortunately a lot of the books these days don't have, but this one does have an index.
So when you're looking at this subject overall, what do you find most speaks to you, or what most stands out to you from being this human with limited physical capacity, a spiritual being in a human condition, in relationship to these things that are going on?
Well, I'm pessimistic about this subject in a way. I'm pessimistic. I wouldn't be surprised if in 100 years' time we're still puzzled by these phenomena. I think these phenomena may be, to some extent, that their true nature may be unknowable. That doesn't mean I don't think it's not worth doing research, but I think that these phenomena may be a little beyond our ability to discern clearly. And I think that may be because, as I say, there could be a higher intelligence that not only is it a higher intelligence, but it also is capable of playing tricks and presenting information in what could be a sort of deceptive way at times. The other problem with this area is there's an awful lot of misinformation in circulation. If you look on the internet, if you look up cases, people will repeat old stories without necessarily checking the facts. And this happens in books as well. So there is an awful lot of misinformation splashing around, which is often repeated, maybe copied from one website to another. And to get to the facts, one often has to dig quite deeply. It's tempting to be cynical and dismiss it all as rubbish, but I don't think that's a realistic thing. And I'm actually a believer in paranormal phenomena. I do believe these things happen. But on the other hand, as I say, I think one has to be very wary. I'll give one brief example. In fact, this is an old example. In the Civil War in England or Britain in the 17th century between Charles I and Parliament, the first main battle was the Battle of Edge Hill in 1642. Now, lots of books mention that after the Battle of Edge Hill, there were ghostly replays of the battle experienced in the area. And these claims are based on two early pamphlets which were published not long after the battle. And one book after another often will repeat these claims, and people tend to believe it. And not only did they claim that the replays of the battle, but the king got to hear about it, it's claimed, and sent a delegation of people to investigate, and his representatives also witnessed the events. Now, I did some historical research into this case some years ago with a colleague, and we did made quite exhaustive inquiries, or best we could, and we found no evidence that really substantiated the claims. For example, the pamphlets claimed that the minister, the religious minister in the village concerned at the time, was a Samuel Marshall. But we discovered that the vicar, that is the minister, at the time was actually someone called Richard Fisher, and we uncovered no evidence suggesting that the king had indeed sent a delegation to investigate the claims. So our conclusion was that the claims in these two pamphlets may have been fictitious. But as I say, what happens, I think, is that if one person reports something, doesn't fully investigate it, check the facts, it gets passed on, someone else repeats the story, and then people tend to assume that the events have really happened, and in fact they maybe haven't. Okay. So I'd say to anyone else investigators, be very careful, check your sources carefully.
So what are your thoughts on the crop circles?
Well, it's a controversial area, that one. Some people claim that all complex crop circles are man-made. Others claim, well, very few have been proven to be fakes or to be man-made. So I'm open-minded about it. Although I think that probably as time goes on, the people who do deliberately create crop circles, they're probably getting technically better and better. So with regard to modern-day crop formations, I think it's probably getting increasingly difficult to know whether there's anything genuinely paranormal about them, because, as I say, it does seem that people can make these formations at least now, and they pass on the skills. And one of the books I've got actually is a how to do it guide. I've never tried it myself, but although an interesting thing about crop circles I've mentioned in passing is, and this is accepted even by people who claim that crop circles are man-made, that even though the crop circles themselves may be man-made, it's said that strange or anomalous phenomena occur within them. So even though the formations themselves, as I say, may be man-made, it doesn't necessarily remove the whole mystery.
Interesting. Peter, thank you so much for joining us today. It was a pleasure having you on.
Thank you.
And again, could you give the title of your book that's available on Amazon?
Yes, it's called Zones of Strangeness, and the subtitle is An Examination of Paranormal and UFO Hotspots.
Okay, that's available on Amazon, so you can check that out there. Tomorrow, as all Fridays, it's the Lisa Leak Show with Lisa Alkins Goodman. Please join us tomorrow at noon Eastern Time. We'll be back then. Thank you again, Peter. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you very much.